Learn to quilt with me. I just finished this table runner last night and I took a whole video of the binding process and I want to take you along with me. If you're first getting into quilting, definitely save this for later because binding is part of almost every quilting project. A lot of patterns will tell you how much binding fabric you need, how wide it needs to be, but they usually don't tell you how to put it on your project and how to finish your quilt. Once you have your binding prepared, I am going to show you how to put it on your quilt and finally finish that project you're working on. Once you have all of your binding strips cut and put together and then pressed in half wrong sides together, I like to roll it up. I do have this spool tool that I use, which I love, but it's totally not necessary. I begin by bringing my binding and my project and laying the project flat in front of me next to my machine. Then I start unrolling my binding here, and I'm going to leave at least 12 inches hanging not attached to my project to begin with. So you want to make sure you have that tail, and then you can pick just about anywhere on your project to begin attaching it. However, I would probably go more towards the middle. I did not leave myself a lot of room here. What you're going to do is match up the raw edges of your folded binding with the raw edge of your project. So if I were to open up the binding here, the fold is towards the left. Once you have that all lined up, we are going to sew a 1/4 inch from those raw edges and sew it onto our project. You're going to go all the way along the edge until you are almost to the corner. I do a little back stitching in the beginning here. You will notice that I am sewing onto the front of my project. You could do the back. This is kind of what I talked about before, where everyone does this a little bit differently. If you're new to this, maybe watch a couple different videos of how to attach binding and then decide how you'd like to do it, or try a few ways your few first projects. How I like to do it is attach it on the front and then I flip it over to the back and then top stitch on the front again, which you will see shortly. As we approach the edge, I am going to be doing a mitered corner on this project. So we will stop about a 1/4 inch from the edge. You can either back stitch here and remove your project. What I like to do is actually put my needle down and then lift up the foot, rotate it so I'm at a 45-degree angle, and then sew right off the edge. And I do a little back stitch here to secure it, and then remove your project, cut the thread, and this is kind of what that should look like. Now we're going to make our mitered corner by folding up at a 45-degree angle and then fold down at a 90-degree angle. I like to use binding clips here. You can use that or pins to kind of hold it in place. And then we take it back to our machine and I will begin stitching along the edge again, just like I had just done. So again, a 1/4 inch away, I start at the very top and then I will stitch all the way down this next edge until again, I get about a 1/4 inch away from the end, and then I will do a mitered corner again, and you just repeat that with all 4 of your corners. Once you have gone all the way around the perimeter of your quilt, you'll need to stop stitching at least, I don't know, I'd give yourself a good foot in between where you start and where you end. And now we need to connect these 2 tails of the binding. I like to take mine over to the ironing board and give it a press when I do this part, just so I can really see where the folds are when I'm doing this. So you lay your project nice and flat, and then somewhere in the middle, fold your binding back on itself on both sides so that they're just touching, but you do not want them overlapping. And then you could just finger press here, but I like to give it a little press with my iron because you're really going to need to see where these folds are when we put these strips together. So I give it a little press and then I will bring it back to my machine to connect them. And this is the part you may have to watch a few times. I am going to connect these with a diagonal seam by taking my top strip and opening it with the right side facing up and my bottom strip right side facing down. I am going to put a pin in right where those folds meet on both of these strips of fabric. So here you'll see where they intersect on both sides. I will grab a pin, stick it right in the center there, and then right through the center of the other one. This is where I may have wished I even gave myself more space in between where I stopped and started my binding, because the more space you give yourself, the easier this is going to be to maneuver and bring to your machine. So you can kind of fold up your project, do whatever you need to do to get these 2 strips laying flat. And then I usually stick some more pins in there to avoid it from shifting at all. And then I will draw a diagonal line from the top where they meet down to the bottom and then sew along that line. Once you have officially sewn those together, go ahead and fold it back in half before trimming to make sure it looks good. It shouldn't be too tight and there shouldn't be too much extra binding here. And if you approve, go ahead and trim it back so there's just a 1/4 inch left of fabric. I like to then take it back to my iron and iron it one more time just to make sure it's nice and flat. And then we will go ahead and finish attaching our binding to the front of our project by sewing a 1/4 inch along the edge that still needs to be attached, just like we did around the rest of our project. Now that we have our binding attached to one side of our project, we need to fold it over and attach it to the other side. This, again, is an area where people will do things differently. It is however you want to finish it. It is your project. A lot of people will hand stitch on their binding to the back with a whip stitch. I personally hate hand stitching. Maybe someday I'll learn how to love it, but I like to machine bind my entire quilt. So I start by pressing my fabric for the binding kind of open, and then I will flip my project around and start folding it and pressing it down onto the other side. When you start folding down to the other side, you will want to make sure that the folded edge of your binding is covering the seam of where you attached it onto the opposite side. You can use binding clips all the way around the edge of your project to fold it down, or I am going to show you my favorite way, and that is with washable glue. I do this by putting a very small amount of glue all the way around the edge and then just keep pressing my binding down on top of it. The heat will dry the glue pretty quickly and it will keep your binding in place so that when you take it to your sewing machine, it is super easy to run it through and attach your binding all of the way. The mitered corners are a little bit of a tricky spot to do, but you just fold one edge and then the other one over it, and then I like to put a clip there just in case. So now that we have all of our binding folded over, we are ready to finally attach it. Here again, you can attach it to the front or the back. I like to put mine on the front really close to where my binding meets my project, and then I like to use a 3.0 stitch length for a little bit of a more quilted top stitch, and then I will just go all the way around the perimeter of my quilt, and that is it. I have my binding attached. Here's what that looks like. And yeah, that's it. That's how you bind a quilt. Good luck, and watch a few videos to get a feel of how you want to bind yours.